Visited the state institutions for the mentally retarded, and I think particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth, but many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because of lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower. There's very little future for the children or for those who are in these institutions.
I was a medical doctor at Willowbrook. I was brought to Willowbrook for the first time on my pediatric rotation during my internship. The smell was the first thing that overwhelmed you when you walked in. An incomparable smell, a combination of human excrement and sweat and smell that once you identify it, you can never miss it again. And then the noise. If you're an auditory person, it strikes you as well because there's a background noise of moaning and yelling and very surreal noises being made by people with no aim in their life. It quickly dawns on you that this is an operation which is for the purpose of housing people without a plan for their life, just as the cliche goes, a warehouse for human beings. It was very overt. You didn't have to think much to figure that part out. They were just sitting there. Just nothing to do all day, just sitting there and rocking. There was a big entrance at Willowbrook where the cars could come, and they had security people checking, and they were not going to let us on the grounds. But it's a huge place, many acres, and so we simply parked on the periphery, and there was this stone fence, and we vaulted the fence, and we ran the 200 yards to the nearest building and easily got in.
Thirty years.
30 years.
30
years.
One voice.
One voice.
One voice.
What is a P&A? To answer that question, you must remember that until the mid-1970s, no federally funded entity existed to protect the legal rights of persons with disabilities. The atrocities at Willowbrook helped motivate the creation and passage of a federal law creating these Protection and Advocacy, or P&A, agencies.
The horrific pictures that document the conditions in Willowbrook State Hospital forced the Congress to take action.
The Federal Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Acts, passed in 1975, created a network of independent watchdog entities that could preserve, protect, and defend the legal rights of persons with disabilities.
Congress created the Protection and Advocacy System in the mid-70s to address the abuse and neglect that people with developmental disabilities were experiencing throughout the country in those large congregate facilities.
Following passage of the Federal Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act in 1975, the state of Kansas received $20,000 to come up with a plan for forming a local protection and advocacy entity. A plan was written, approved by Governor Robert F. Bennett, and submitted for federal approval. The Kansas Advocacy and Protective Services for the Developmentally Disabled was born.
Former Governor, God rest his soul, Bennett, is the one who designated this agency as a protection and advocacy system for Kansas and made it separate from state government. And that was an incredible move, and it's still benefiting people with disabilities today.
As new services were added, the name would later be shortened to Kansas Advocacy and Protective Services, or CAPS. Joan Strickler was chosen to be the agency's first executive director, and office space was rented in Manhattan, Kansas. The year was 1977.
I first became acquainted with protection and advocacy systems when I worked at the State Department of Education. When we would have a child whose rights were clearly being interfered with, and it really needed, beyond just an advocate, it needed an attorney, someone who knew the law very well and could talk to the schools about the law and what they needed to do, we would refer them to Kansas Protection and Advocacy Services so that the child and the parent would get some representation of a legal basis without having to go out and spend a lot of money.
Congress has, over the last 25 years, added additional programs to our system to ensure that all people with disabilities would receive the same types of protections and legally based advocacy that only the protection and advocacy system can provide.
Thanks to the subpoena power that's granted to us and our independence, we are able to get into situations and investigate the problems that our clients present to us and aggressively advocate on behalf of our clients, no matter who it is that they might be dealing with.
P&As, like the Disability Rights Center of Kansas, are multidisciplinary organizations that provide a wide array of services, including legal assistance and advocacy representation, public policy advocacy, and educating the public, as well as outreach and training for persons with disabilities. DRC serves Kansans with all types of disabilities. Starting in early 2004, DRC conducted a comprehensive agency-wide reorganization. The reorganization has resulted in better outcomes from these core services.
I would hope that we've made a difference in the lives of people with disabilities.
DRC is mainly funded with federal grants. However, as a 501c3 nonprofit, DRC can also accept charitable donations and gifts, which are tax deductible. Due to its limited funding, for about every 10 Kansans who request some type of service from the DRC, it can only fund legal representation for one. However, DRC does provide a service to every person with a disability who requests services, even if it cannot provide legal representation. These include information and referral, self-advocacy support, and advocacy representation.
It is so important to advocate and protect people who are not able to advocate and protect themselves.
Disability Rights Center knows, they understand clearly, they're very knowledgeable about the law, what the disability community needs, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you can just get feedback so much easier with the DRC people because they know what they're doing.
They do that at no cost to the individual with disability because many times those people just could not afford to hire an attorney and otherwise would just be walked all over.
Disability Rights Centers obviously have that focus, that training, that experience, that sensitivity, that connection, both with the population and with resources and services that are available to them.
Otherwise, there would be no access to the legal system except for private lawyers. Look in the phone book, watch TV, and so on.
I just want to thank Disability Rights Center for all their wonderful work and excellent work, and hope that they continue for other people. We really do need you.
I was shocked. That's the reaction of 14-year-old Jessica Howe after she saw what was allegedly going on at this Butler County farm.
He would bring people out to the house, and they would all be working nude.
October 26, 2004. Agents from the FBI, along with the staff from the U.S. Department of Justice and the Disability Rights Center, raided the property of Arlen and Linda Kaufman.
That's why federal agents busted 68-year-old Arlen Kaufman and his 61-year-old wife, Linda.
What they found was shocking beyond belief.
They were supposed to be caring for the mentally ill, but instead, prosecutors say they made naked slaves out of the patients.
During the trial, a lot of facts came out that were horrific and really make you shudder.
Just to realize that someone actually had so little regard for human dignity that they would be willing to put somebody through that.
Abuse that they were subjected to was just unimaginable.
For more than a decade, the Kaufmans, under the guise of therapy, had engaged in the systematic physical, psychological, and sexual abuse of individuals with mental illness who resided in the Kaufmans' group homes in Newton, Kansas. The Kaufmans had proven themselves to be experts at evading law enforcement and state regulators as they engaged in their brutal exploitation of residents with mental illness.
A critical part of their scheme was that they absolutely restricted access of their residents to the outside world. They discouraged family visits, and many of these residents didn't really have families who wanted to visit. They're all older adults, some near retirement age. They instructed the residents that if anyone shows up at the door not to let them in. On a couple of occasions when Harvey County law enforcement, Newton police, had tried to visit the residents, they'd immediately notify the Kaufmans, who quickly came over and barred them from entering. They were very aggressive in dealing with law enforcement who was making an inquiry.
Over a 20-year period, at least 10 complaints, including 4 from former residents or family members, were made to state agencies about the Kaufman house. After 10 state agency investigations that spanned 2 decades, little had changed and the horrors continued. The Disability Rights Center stepped in, exercised its powers under federal law, and conducted an on-site investigation of the Kaufman house. One resident then asked an attorney of DRC for help, saying, "I don't want to be naked anymore." The very next day, DRC attorneys provided civil, legal representation to get the first resident out of the Kaufman house and to safety. The first witness was now free from the Kaufman's influence.
As a survivor of Kaufman House, would like people to understand that if it hadn't been for the protective advocacy federal statutes that allow them to walk in and check out how the victim was doing, the Kaufman House would still be in business today. DRC, they were able to go knock on the door of Kaufman House, the door opened, and they were able to get the first victim of Kaufman House out after 20 years of no one getting us out.
DRC had the ability to go in and do some things under their authority that we weren't able to do or weren't able to do as quickly as they could get it done. I mean, they were able to step in and work on behalf of those individuals, the victims in that case, a lot quicker than we could have under the state system, because they had other authority, other regulations and rules that they could operate under that were going to allow them to do things and do them a lot quicker.
What others couldn't get done in over 20 years, within 5 months of DRC's investigation and action, the Kaufmans were arrested.
One of the things that was unique about the Kaufman approach was that we knew when we went in to execute search warrants and to make arrests for both Arlen and Linda Kaufman that we were going to face a situation of having to have a plan in place to deal with the residents of the house. As I indicated, there were a number of adults who lived there who had various forms of mental illness or mental disabilities, who either because they couldn't take care of themselves or had been conditioned to rely on others, weren't
going to be in a situation to immediately provide for their own living and housing arrangements.
We have advocates, we have attorneys, we have administrators who all serve people with disabilities and serve their interests. The best thing for the victims was to ensure that they got justice, and so we worked with the victims to get them justice through the criminal prosecution and the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Through the assistance both first for referral through the Kansas Attorney General's Office and the assistance of the Disability Rights Center, we managed to get court orders freeing the residents from those houses. Then we filed criminal charges, both civil rights and healthcare fraud and abuse charges against Arlen and Linda Kaufman.
Thanks to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Arlen Kaufman was found guilty on 31 federal counts and Linda Kaufman guilty on 30 federal counts, including involuntary servitude, forced labor, conspiracy, healthcare fraud, mail fraud, and Medicare fraud. Helping to bring the Kaufmans to justice and helping the residents free themselves from the Kaufmans' reign of abuse will forever be a pinnacle achievement in the history of the Disability Rights Center.
Thank God that the DRC was around to kind of fight for those people, to help get them out of their environments, and now thanks to DRC, those people are now living better lives.
That's why we're there. A big reason why we're there is that we can take those most heinous acts and hopefully try to get justice. Because of limited resources, we can't take every case, and there's a lot of cases that we'd love to take if we had more dollars to be able to get justice for the individual who was wronged. But with those cases where atrocities have happened and abuse and neglect has occurred, we then have the resources, the staff time, and the really legal authority to do something about it and to get justice, to shine light on places that before were incredibly dark.
For Kansas boys, summer and baseball go hand in hand. But one Kansas boy was told he wouldn't be allowed to play ball.
Matthew Whaley is just an incredible kid, and his mom, Jennifer Behrens, is an amazing person, has incredible strength.
When Matthew was 7, we signed him up to play coach pitch ball at the rec league in the town in which we lived, and everything was going along, and we got a phone call from the coach's wife, and I had informed her that I had had conversations with the rec department and that Matthew has cerebral palsy and that he would require some extra attention, and that I would be willing to attend those practices to provide him with that attention. However, she had not been informed of any of Matthew's disabilities or anything regarding any of that, and so at that time she followed up with the director at the Rec Commission, at which time they determined that Matthew would not be allowed to play.
What happened to Matthew, unfortunately, happens to a lot of people with disabilities. They're shut out of society and not allowed to participate and discriminated against. Matthew wanted what any 7-year-old at the time would want. It's what I wanted when I was a 7-year-old. I wanted to play baseball.
Matthew and his family chose to fight for the ability to do what any other child gets to do: play baseball.
I had made numerous phone calls to private attorneys. I'd looked online, looked around through to hire an attorney, and we couldn't find anybody that was willing to take it for pay because they had just not dealt with anything of that nature. And so previously I had a connection at the Center for Independent Living in Garden City, and so I called them to see if they could provide me with some assistance, and their advice was to contact Kirk at the Disability Rights Center and to request their assistance in the matter.
You shouldn't have to file a lawsuit to do that, but sometimes you do.
Thanks to the tenacity of Matthew and his mom Jennifer, as well as the services of the Disability Rights Center, Matthew got to play ball.
The first game, it was kind of tense with the other people who kind of knew what was going on. However, it was really nice to see Matthew on the ball field playing with his with his peers and his brother, and he was really excited to be able to play.
Matthew also got to share his story nationally.
We received a call from Rocky at the Disability Rights Center asking if Matthew and I would be willing to travel to Washington, D.C. And speak with the individuals from the National Disability Rights Network. They had a ceremony, and Matthew and I spoke at that ceremony along with another individual who had also had similar experiences with discrimination.
What has happened to public attitudes toward the disabled in these 15 years?
Attitudes have changed, but not always. And there were two stories in the news this past month of kids playing baseball. One was a kid named Matthew Whaley, who's an 8-year-old in Kansas, and he has cerebral palsy. He uses a walker. He wanted to play baseball like his older brother, but the recreation department said no. Matthew Whaley went into a courtroom and showed the judge how he can swing a bat with one hand and hold on to the walker with the other. The judge said, let's let him play. And so